morning. I'm Dr. Suraiya Shahin, and today I will teach you neoclassical poetry. Who are neoclassical poets? A style of their poetry, themes and characteristics of their poetry. So today I will cover all these points. So the neoclassical age is called the age of reason and enlightenment. The neoclassical age is called the age of reason and enlightenment. The neoclassical era in the history of English literature begins in 1660 and it goes to 1798. If you want to know the literal meaning of neoclassicism, it is made of two words. The word neoclassicism is made of two words, neo and classic. The word classic refers to the art and culture, writing style, and the works of the ancient authors of Greece and Rome. And the word neo is derived from the Greek word neos, which means new. Clear? So, neoclassicism, clear? The poets of neoclassical age greatly followed the footsteps of the authors writing during the reign of Roman Emperor Augustus. Keep in the mind, the poets of neoclassical age greatly followed the footsteps of the authors writing during the reign of Roman Emperor Augustus. Horace, Virgil, Ovid, and other classical writers influenced the neoclassical poets like Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, John Dryden, and others. Clear? Now I'll talk about who are the neoclassical poets. The major neoclassical poets are Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson, John Dryden, Thomas Gray, James Thomson, William Cowper. Clear? Now I'll talk about the style of the neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets adopted a new trend while writing their poetry. They wrote their poetry in elevated language and formal language. They wrote their poetry in elevated and formal language by drawing Latin and Greek vocabulary and syntax. They adhered to a refined, sophisticated style. They adhered to a refined, sophisticated style which serves to write poetry by using distinguished language. Now, I will focus on the characteristics of neoclassical poetry. And the first is the influence of classical forms. Neoclassical poets greatly followed the ancient Greek and Roman writers' poetic forms and structures. Neoclassical poets greatly followed the ancient Greek and Roman writers' poetic forms and structures. The classical forms of poetry like ode, pastoral poem, epic poem proved to be the standards of the literary excellence of the neoclassical poetry. Clear? The influence of classical forms. Next characteristic is emphasis on reason and logic. Neoclassical poets emphasized reason and logic. Neoclassical poets emphasized reason and logic because they believed in the concept that poetry should appeal to the intellect rather than only to the emotions. They believed in the concept that poetry should appeal to the intellect rather than only to the emotions. They created their poetry well structured to convey the rational ideas and arguments with clarity, precision, and universality. Clear? Next characteristic is moral and didactic. Neoclassical poets wrote poetry on moral and didactic themes. Neoclassical poets wrote poetry on moral and didactic themes. Why? Because they believed in the concept that poetry should be written with didactic purpose. Poetry should be written with didactic purpose to teach the readers the relevant ethical and philosophical ideas and values. Through the medium of their poetry, they tried to shape the values and attitudes of their society. As we find these characteristics in the poetry of Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson, John Dryden, and others whose poetry engaged with the contemporary social and intellectual issues of the 18th century. Clear? Now, the next characteristic is nature. We find the depiction of nature and natural world as significant themes in neoclassical poetry, which serves as a source of inspiration of harmony and order. Poets like James Thomson, in his work The Seasons, emphasized the beauty and majesty of nature. So neoclassical poets also talks about the love for nature. The next characteristic is social criticism. Through the medium of their poetry, neoclassical poets critiqued the social and political issues of their time. Through the medium of their poetry, neoclassical poets critiqued the social and political issues of their time. Satire was the major literary form that they used to unveil and expose the vices of their society. Alexander Pope's The Danciad, The Rape of the Lock, and Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal are the major satirical works of that time, which largely expose the follies and vices of the contemporary society. Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel and MacFlecknoe also demonstrate the political and social issues. So, through their poetry, they sought to reform the moral and ethical values. Clear? The next characteristic is use of heroic couplets. The heroic couplet consists of two rhyming lines in iambic pentameter. The heroic couplet consists of two rhyming lines in iambic pentameter. Heroic couplet is one of the most prominent forms of the neoclassical poetry. Poets like John Dryden, Alexander Pope mostly followed heroic couplet to create well-structured forms and poems with great wit, precision, and rhetorical force to express the philosophical and moral ideas. Clear? The next characteristic is poetic forms and structures. Neoclassical poets followed the poetic forms and structures from the ancient Greek and Roman writers. Very important point. Neoclassical poets followed the poetic forms and structures from the ancient Greek and Roman writers. The poetic forms, such as the ode, epic, pastoral poem, elegy, satirical poem, are mainly established by ancient Greek and Roman writers, which influenced the neoclassical writers. Next characteristic is Latin and Greek allusions. We find in the poetry of neoclassical writers allusions to Latin and Greek literature, philosophy, and history. The neoclassical poets highly engaged their poetry with references to Virgil, Horace, and Homer. By using Latin and Greek allusions, they tried to elevate the language and style of their poetry, which separated their poetry from everyday speech. Alexander Pope, in his The Rape of Lock, illustrates the classical allusions. So that is the characteristic. And the last is reason versus emotion. In neoclassical poetry, we find the conflict between reason and emotion as a significant theme. In neoclassical poetry, we find the conflict between reason and emotion as a significant theme. We see in the poems of Dr. Johnson such as London and the Vanity of Human Wishes, which demonstrate the themes of morality and the challenges of urban life. So these are the characteristics of neoclassical poetry. Thanks for today. We meet in the next class.